Welcome back to session 3, the security implications of climate change. And we're very lucky to have Rear Admiral Neal Morisetti. He is the UK's climate change and energy security envoy. He speaks power to power about power and climate change and much else in climate change. Neal.
John, thank you very much. It might seem somewhat odd to have a serving military officer standing here talking about climate change, even one who studied it at university, or would have done if he hadn't been playing so much sport. But this session, we hope to talk about what it means for us. And with me, I've got Lionel Jarvis, who straddles two professions, the military and the health. On that screen later will be Shea from Brussels, who will give you a wider NATO perspective of these issues, and Colley from the Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre, which is the Ministry of Defence's in-house think tank, who are paid to look to the future. We've heard a lot this morning about the science, and I have no intention of trying to complement any of the scientists' comments. But increasingly, there's a recognition that as well as other issues, including environmental, health, socioeconomic, there are security implications associated with climate change. That's reflected in the American Quadrennial Defense Review in 2010. It's reflected in this side of the Atlantic in our Strategic Defense Review and many other pieces. We are thinking about the second and third order consequences. What happens to those people who lose their land or lose their livelihood? If they migrate, is it planned, coordinated, and manageable migration in a country or between countries, or is it unplanned mass migration that causes tension? If they lose their livelihood because of rising sea levels, rising temperatures, loss of crop yields, etc., acidity in the oceans, so they find a legal livelihood to replace that, or are they susceptible of recruiting into crime, or ultimately the $5 a day in AK-47 terrorist? We do not see climate change as the direct cause of conflict, rather as a threat multiplier or increasing the risk of instability globally. But why does that worry us? Surely a bit of global warming in the UK, Sauvignon Blanc from the Isle of Jura, perfect. Well, the reality is, and you've seen the map shown on a number of occasions today, the world is globalized. Climate change will have its greatest effect where we're already experiencing stress. Food shortages, health shortages, demographic problems, parts of the world in that equatorial belt where we have seen conflict time and time again in the last 40 or 50 years. Partly because the countries there and their governments do not have the capacity and resilience to cope with those stresses and look after their population. So we're going to have climate change. But it still doesn't worry us, does it? Well, slap bang through the middle of that goes the world's trade routes. Trade routes for energy, for us in Europe, through the Middle East. From the Middle East, China, 75% of their oil through the Malacca Straits. But not just energy, food. Tesco's, Waitrose, Morrison's and all the others, all their stock. A lot of that comes by sea, along those trade routes. The warehouses of the world today are afloat, they're not along riversides. And that means if that's interrupted because of instability in regions, it affects all of us. It's in all our interest to deal with this. Which is why Paul's organisation, in their Look Ahead to the World of 2040, Global Strategic Trends, describe climate change as a ring road issue. In other words, it will affect all of us in the next 30 years. But what are we going to do about it? Well, new threats, new challenges need new means of tackling them. In the good old days, diplomacy did their piece, politicians did their piece, and as one senior diplomat said to me, when we've all failed, in come the military. The reality is now, to tackle the threats we face, we need a whole-of-government approach, we need a whole-of-society approach, and we need an international approach. But what does that mean for us in the military? Well, we are part of society. We work for a government department, and we're international in the way we do our business. So we have a part to play, we have responsibilities as well. I suggest the first one is to help the analysis of the problem, to understand more about it. Rather than Africa or Asia will be affected by climate change, to understand where the most vulnerable parts are and how we address that to reduce those risks. Because it's only when you've done that analysis that you can manage those risks. You can make judgments on priorities of all the many other conflicts and threats to national interests and global stability. We need to know what it means for our missions and our tasks. We've heard more about extreme weather events, and undoubtedly we'll find ourselves involved in more humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in the immediate aftermath of such events. But there's another piece. I spoke about the lack of capacity and resilience in countries to deal with the stresses. In our Strategic Defence and Security Review and in the QDR, there's a recognition that we're going to become more involved in conflict prevention. A small actor amongst many others who are much more qualified, have much wider roles, government and non-government. But we have a part to play in building capacity and stability overseas. And that's reflected in the government's Building Stability Overseas strategy that was published in July. We need to know how we're going to work with all the actors and how we're going to draw the best capabilities from everybody. We need to have the right capabilities to ensure that we can deliver the missions and tasks we find ourselves doing. Not just today, where current operations must be our priority, but also into the future. And we touched on one of the issues associated with that earlier on this morning. Energy. We are the great gas guzzlers of the world in the military. I was a captain of an aircraft carrier. Any guesses how much I got to the gallon? 12 inches. I burnt 20 tons of fuel an hour launching and recovering jets. You can do that at $30 a barrel. You can't do it at 150, 200. It was a vulnerability as well as a coster. I had to take a floating petrol station with me. I had to protect that petrol station. And every 3 or 4 days, I spent 3 or 4 hours taking fuel from that petrol station, which meant I wasn't flying jets. And I was pumping CO2 out of the funnel. It's the same in the land environment. Nothing new there. Napoleon ran out of fodder. Patton ran out of petrol. We've all seen the Battle of the Bulge film where the tanks grind to a halt. All our fuel in Afghanistan comes by convoy from Karachi. About half the convoy is fuel. It needs to be protected. It costs a fortune, about 10 times the pump price at least. And it constrains our ability to do our business. We have, in that challenge, an opportunity to be more operationally effective, to reduce risks and reduce costs, and make our contribution to reducing CO2 emissions. As I speak, there are members of the United States Marine Corps in Afghanistan charging their batteries using solar panels and photovoltaic cells. And there are Royal Marines in America testing that sort of equipment. We also have to need to look to the future and make sure that when we deliver our capabilities, they are sustainable, and we recognise those challenges. But as I said, there are opportunities that come with all of this. And it's not just for us in the military, it comes to everybody, those opportunities. But we have one other role, and we touched on it in the last session. We can be a messenger. Because if we can do that in the military, I suggest all of society can, but it's about explaining to people why it's in their interest to do so, where the benefits and the opportunities come from. If I suggest to the Deputy Head of Defence, I want to talk about greening the British Armed Forces, his office is on the 5th floor. I will be on the ground floor quite quickly. If I talk about improving our operational effectiveness, reducing our risks, and reducing our costs, as he said, it's a no-brainer. And we've got to get the message out to everybody, it's a no-brainer to address this issue. Thank you.
So, directly to Rear Admiral Lionel Jarvis, he's the Chief Medical Officer, effectively, of the Ministry of Defence, so he bridges security and health.
John, thank you, and Neal for that, and I'm delighted to be able to participate in this conference as one who clearly straddles both areas of health and security. This is what I usually do on the picture here, but I hope over the next 10 minutes I'll describe why I hope I talk on behalf of many in those communities of medical professionals who work in the overseas and global environment, including Lord Jay's Merlin and the many, many organisations who are engaged in the global challenges that health brings. And I won't repeat, but simply re-emphasize that those who talk about climate change in isolation completely miss the point. I was at a meeting last week actually in Washington when a security meeting talking about the critical pillars of human security. These are moderately self-explanatory and probably most of you are familiar with them. It is perhaps striking, as it did to me at that time, that there is no such bullet as environmental stability, and that perhaps reflects much of the global thinking and is clearly something that I believe we need to address with a matter of urgency within that framework. This is a picture produced, combined from both Air Vice Marshal Colley's organisation, Defence Concept and Doctrine Centre, but as you can see below the Hadley Centre from the Met Office, with which many of you perhaps might know its extremely close links to the Ministry of Defence. It emphasises the close relationship we have with the long-term global interests in climate change, but secondly gives the sort of big bang issues that might threaten security globally, and therefore in a global world, security for the UK. So, on to the combined impacts, and where I bring perhaps just one or two different slants to the medical and security impacts. We've heard this before. The population is increasing inexorably. We all wish that wasn't the case. It is an inevitability, and it certainly wasn't a problem millennia ago. But where is it increasing? Well, the darker colours show where, as a result of simple population expansion, but overlain by migration, the population is increasing at its greatest rate. And no surprises for seeing that it is very heavily, particularly in Southeast Asia, around Africa and around India, in coastal areas, and again in the Americas around coastal areas. And not simply an expansion symmetrically of population in the global sphere, but a dramatic increase in urbanization, with levels of world population that are urban increasing on that scale, such that we still were a moderately rural, nomadic and migrant population across the world only 110 years ago, and now we are over 50% of this massively increasing population is moving into urban territories. So I put it to you that in one particular sphere, we have a massively increasing population, increasingly urban, on coastal areas, many of them low-lying, and therefore the most susceptible mass immobile populations ready to receive the onslaught of the extremes in weather and climate that the climate change modelers will predict. And there, of course, is the big difference from millennia ago. Why is it so much more of a problem for now? Well, 10,000 years ago, even 2,000 years ago, a predominantly rural migrant population could be ready to respond to the challenges of an emerging change in climate as you'd move your herds and flocks north, south, east, or west. But now we are completely immobile and unable to respond in that simple way to this challenge, and as a consequence, we can inevitably, and I talk about not just the urban stresses, but anywhere else across the world, we have an inevitability of the consequences in public health: overcrowding, poor sanitation, food shortage, water shortage, disease, and malnutrition. And as the public health advisors have commented already this morning, this is, to my mind, fundamentally a public health challenge. Here on these pictures, as a year ago in Brazil on the left and on the right in Australia, they could be today with 45 deaths in Honduras in the past 24 hours following a mudslide, and much of Thailand underwater right now, graphically demonstrating that year on year these global events are increasing. Add to that with the subjects well spoken about this morning, shortage of food, water and fuel, exacerbating the stresses on those already damaged citizens and regrettably resulting in pictures such as this, and emphasizing the fact that it is not the same across the world, but regrettably we have immense inequalities on a global scale that show no evidence of changing and in fact in some respects becoming more exaggerated. Which brings me on to where we close the circle ourselves, but I should think it's pretty clear to everyone out there that inequality, stresses, resource shortage are all great fomites of conflict, and this cycle perpetuates. We have economic instability right now, we have resource shortage, we have food and water scarcity and competition, and it's no surprise that those themselves bring conflict, which actually further exacerbate the cycle. And we lay on top of that the tipping point of climate change that will hit any one of those. And inevitably those of us who are sucked into trying to provide medical support, healthcare, interventions, public health and humanitarian aid to many parts of the world subject to those stresses, watch with considerable concern and anxiety how climate change will add that additional tipping point to those already existing stresses. Thank you very much indeed.
Now, thanks to some clean technology, we're going to go live to Brussels, where I'm delighted to say there is Jamie Shea, sitting patiently waiting to talk to us. Jamie, thank you very much. Would you like to proceed?
Many thanks indeed. Sorry I can't be with you, but hopefully technology is working. Now, I must say I'm seeing you well, but the sound wasn't particularly good over the last 10 minutes or so. So can I just check first and foremost that in addition to seeing me, which of course is always nice, but more importantly, you can actually hear me. Is the sound okay?
We can see you, and we can hear you even better than we can see you, because you're kind of slightly Skypey.
Fantastic. Which shows that things tend to work better from Brussels to London than vice versa. But I won't elaborate on that point anymore. No, thanks. Thanks very much for the opportunity to participate in the debate, and thanks to you in particular, Neal Morisetti. I think that, you know, for a security organisation like NATO, climate change poses some enormous intellectual challenges that we still have to really come to grips with. And the first one is that, you know, traditionally security threats are localised, they take place in a particular area of the world, they are bound up with a particular political regime with particular capabilities, and the military love that sort of sense of focused precision. And here we come to climate change, which is virtually everywhere, at least in large areas of the world. It's not bound up with any particular threat, any regime, any particular capability. And the second problem, of course, is it's very difficult to actually separate climate change from other phenomena, and then to wonder when you get a particular incident of flooding or a hurricane or a particularly hot summer with lots of citizens dying from heat waves, whether this is really simply a natural freak or whether it's now part of a pattern which is, if not induced, at least exacerbated by climate change. The third problem, I think, for the military mind or the strategies is that there is a loop whereby obviously industrialization, population growth, resource consumption, food and so on is driving climate change, but at the same time that climate change then in return, in a kind of feedback loop, exacerbates those very problems. And of course, at what point with these phenomena increasingly interacting, do you reach the trigger point where a growing stress actually produces a crisis? Because I have to, I think, make one point pretty clear from the outset. NATO's role is not in preventing climate change. I very much hope that post-Copenhagen we can come up with a new international climate treaty which can curb the rise in carbon dioxide emissions, but that's not NATO's job. The job of NATO is to be ready to respond. But if I could make one general point about the debate, I often feel that much of the effort, and I understand this, is going into the whole idea of what we can do to mitigate climate change by, of course, trying to stop or freeze the CO2 emissions at certain levels. That's right. But of course, the problem with focusing on that is that one tends to feel that therefore we don't have to address now some of the scenarios which are going to come our way, even if we are successful at stopping warming to, say, the really horrendous levels of sort of 3 to 5 percentage points, and we can keep it at 2. So I do feel that one of the things that we have to do in the Alliance is recognise that on a parallel track, we have to already think now of the inevitable consequences, which even would result from a success story in terms of a global treaty. What is the first thing we have to do? Well, the first thing is geopolitics. It's obviously the case that climate change is going to change the ranking order of states in the world. There will be winners from this phenomenon. The problem is many of the winners are countries in the Northern Hemisphere, which are already well geared and have the resources to deal with the domestic challenges that they're going to face, and they're going to be losers. And the problem, of course, is the losers tend to be in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where there are already severe developmental problems. But that geopolitics is clearly going to sort of, for NATO, present new challenges. I mean, the High North is something that's often referred to with the melting of the polar ice cap and the fact that there will be not just increased competition for oil and gas resources in the area, but far more shipping going through, with the consequence of disasters and the need to have some kind of presence in the area which could cope with accidents, for example, of oil tankers hitting residual icebergs. So we need, first of all, to look at how geopolitics will change. The second thing, of course, is to see to what degree climate change, or at least a lack of governance to address these kind of issues, are going to produce new threats. For example, piracy, on which so far we've spent anywhere between about $7 and $12 billion, is largely a result of a lack of governance in Somalia, which then leads to overfishing in the area, which leads to the dumping of toxic waste as people feel that they can get away with it, which of course in return leads to fishermen losing their livelihoods and then becoming pirates, with the result that shipping companies are paying $400 million in ransoms a year, and as I've said, the cost of the naval patrolling goes upwards into the billion, all as a result of a knock-on effect of climate change. I mean, other areas, of course, are the Middle East, where you have already a situation of stress and political tension. On top of that, of course, competition over water resources can act as a trigger. The other thing that I think is going to be important too is the responsibility to protect. We've just had in Libya an example of a NATO operation which was done with a UN mandate in the name of the responsibility to protect, based on the classical scenario of a man-made impending disaster against the civilian population of Benghazi. But Burma, a few years ago, where flooding and a monsoon in the Irrawaddy Delta caused a great migration of population against the background of a regime that didn't seem to be wanting international effort, could have easily become a situation of the duty of the responsibility to protect for a natural disaster, whether or not directly caused by climate change. So are we going to get into those kind of scenarios in the future? What is clear is the extent of some of the disasters that we've seen recently have involved unprecedented military mobilization. For example, Hurricane Katrina, which cost the United States $125 billion of damage in the first 24 hours, saw the mobilization of 30,000 US forces in the area to stop the rioting, of course, to try to deal with the impacts, the initial impacts of the flooding, carry out humanitarian rescue. NATO itself, over the last few years, has sent military forces, albeit in limited numbers, to Poland, to the eastern part of Germany, to Ukraine, to deal with the consequences of flooding as well. Now, when it comes to and a thing like climate change, the first thing is to try to at least conceptually get the topic on your agenda, to give yourself a mandate to discuss it. That, I'm pleased to say, NATO has finally done, because I think here we are playing catch-up vis-à-vis the efforts that other speakers were talking about, efforts made by the US, the UK and other countries nationally. NATO has finally caught up the strategic concepts of the alliance, which we agreed in Lisbon last year for the first time, says that we need to worry about climate change, health risks, water scarcity, increasing energy needs. The problem is it doesn't say exactly what we should do, apart from put those topics on the agenda. And I think that is the challenge that we face now. Very briefly, every international organisation can offer certain assets. The question is will those assets be fully exploited? Will the organisation live up to its potential? Will those assets be effectively coordinated with the other players so that they add value in terms of achieving a critical mass? Will the political will in the organisation be there to see climate change as a priority for the alliance in an operational sense, rather than as an interesting academic study? First of all, Neal Morisetti did, of course, refer very much to the urgent need of the military to reduce its energy footprint. I mean, it's not just, Neal, as you know, a question of cost or even the health of the environment. We see today, as you know, in Pakistan, with the number of NATO fuel trucks that are seized by Taliban forces or sabotaged en route, just how vulnerable you are in an operation like Afghanistan when you need to transport in every day millions of litres of fuel by trucks through the Khyber Pass. And in fact, to get around that problem, we've had to open up a second route through Russia and Central Asia into Afghanistan. So high carbon footprint certainly increases your operational vulnerability along with everything else. The other thing I think we can do is offer scientific cooperation. Now, I know that people in the audience will be flabbergasted hearing me say this, because isn't NATO a military organisation? Yes, to a certain point, but we also have a science programme which has done a great deal of work with partner countries to try to help them address issues related to climate change. For example, desertification in Egypt. One project that I personally have been involved in concerns the Pripyat River running between Belarus and Ukraine, which has a history of very damaging flooding, and where we've been able to pay for water flood level monitoring stations, seismic studies and so on, to try to predict more accurately when that flooding might occur to aid crisis management. I mentioned already NATO's role in civil emergency planning. We have a Euro-Atlantic Disaster Relief Coordination Centre and a history indeed, both among allies and partners, of using our military assets to deal with humanitarian situations. I think probably two stand out, again related to Pakistan: the Kashmir earthquake in 2006, when we deployed the NATO Rapid Response Force to Kashmir in order to set up field hospitals, to help clear roads, to helicopter in emergency relief supplies, on the basis that a military organisation, and this was said already by Admiral Morisetti a moment ago, is often able to mobilise this heavy-duty kind of equipment faster than sometimes the NGOs or the civilian agencies, at least on a temporary basis, to establish a bridgehead upon which those civilian agencies can build. I mean, NATO also has dealt with the aftermath of the flooding in Pakistan last year as well, again diverting some of the troops, forces, particularly helicopters that we had in Afghanistan south of the border to help the Pakistanis. We've also, by the way, extensively helped with the UN refugee agency in the Balkans, although that was, of course, again, a man-made disaster in Kosovo, not a climate change disaster. But again, the military did prove that they were able, in terms of water supplies, medical supplies, building camps to help. Another thing I'd like to mention very briefly, and I promise to wrap up in just a couple of seconds here, but is the whole idea, and this was mentioned already by the previous speaker, of medicine. I mean, we do a lot of work now in the Alliance on military medicine related to operational deployments. But again, if our military forces in the future are going to have to operate in warmer or more stressed environments, which then present whole challenges in terms of possible diseases. A lot of this research is directly applicable to the civilian area too. For example, we've seen just last year dengue fever making its appearance in southern Europe, as we have with West Nile viruses as well. So I think that is an area. Finally, just as I stop, I think that there are things down the road. One, of course, is modelling. The military NATO has a lot of ISR, as it's called, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, satellite capability. We're investing in this all the time to improve our situational awareness. I can quite see that a lot of this capability can be used to study the possible impact of climate change on certain areas of the world, to try to identify critical masses or trigger points as well. Secondly, critical infrastructure. As we see our infrastructure having to operate like our military forces in more extreme temperatures, what is going to be the consequences for SCADAs, for pipelines, for vital communication nodes on which our economic sustenance depends, and what could be the role of NATO in helping to protect that critical infrastructure or repair it in a disastrous situation. There is, and this is my final point, though, a question of the comprehensive approach. NATO and the military can never be a sole solution, even if they can be helpful in these kind of scenarios. One's effectiveness depends upon one's ability to work with others and persuade them to work with you, both in terms of other international organisations, but also in terms domestically of the ability of the military to work with the fire services, the health services, the police. In some countries, the military have a mandate to intervene domestically, but in other countries, they don't. Under the law and constitution, they can only be used outside the borders. And so I think we also have to look at some of these legal constitutional arrangements if it is going to be the case that our military will increasingly have to assist not only in humanitarian operations beyond our borders, but also look at some of the things we've experienced in Europe over the last few years. Massive fires in Russia, in Greece, almost medieval levels of flooding in Switzerland when I was there a few years ago. We may have to also see our military taking on a rather unaccustomed role inside our borders as well. And some kind of legal constitutional clarity would help here, where NATO, again, I think, could usefully have a debate. I've far exceeded my time, and you probably will never invite me back as a result, but that's what I wanted to say for now, and thank you for listening.